The lighthouse keeper's daughter knew things others didn't. Secrets whispered by the wind through the weathered shingles of Morrow's Cove. Truths carried on salt-heavy air that made the elderly residents' eyes water and their memories blur. Margaret Holloway had always believed the village's isolation protected them from the cruelties of the outside world. But as she stood at her kitchen window watching the morning fog roll in from the Atlantic, she wondered if perhaps it had been protecting the world from them. The termination letter still lay on her kitchen table, its corporate letterhead stark against the sun-bleached wood. 6 months since Davies and Associates had deemed her redundant due to restructuring corporate speak for too old, too expensive, too inconvenient. At 58, Margaret had given them 23 years of her life, building their client relationships from her small satellite office overlooking the harbor. Now, with the annual company gala approaching, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her quiet existence in this forgotten corner of Maine. The fog thickened, and in its swirling depths, Margaret could swear she saw shapes that shouldn't exist, figures moving with purpose through the mist, heading toward shore. Margaret's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she watched the harbor through salt-stained windows. The Morrow's Cove marina stretched below her cottage like arthritic fingers reaching into dark water, its weathered docks empty save for a few lobster boats that seemed to materialize and vanish with the tide. The village had been dying slowly for decades, its population dwindling from 300 to barely 37 souls who clung to the rocky coastline like barnacles. She had moved here after the divorce, seeking solitude and finding something else entirely, a position with Davies and Associates that allowed her to work remotely while building relationships with their maritime clients. For over 2 decades, she had been their most reliable account manager, her deep understanding of coastal businesses and fishing operations making her indispensable. Or so she had believed. The memory of that final video call still burned. Jonathan Davies himself had delivered the news, his face pixelated and distant on her laptop screen. His words had been careful, rehearsed, but his meaning clear. The company was moving in a new direction, embracing fresh perspectives, optimizing their workforce for the digital age. At 58, Margaret was a relic of an analog world they no longer needed. What haunted her wasn't the dismissal itself, but something else, something in Davies' eyes during that call. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even fear, when she had mentioned she would be attending the company gala as planned. Her severance package included an invitation, a gesture of goodwill, they claimed. But that look in his eyes suggested otherwise. Margaret set down her cup and walked to the window. The fog was lifting, revealing the familiar landscape of Morrow's Cove in sharp detail. The village consisted of perhaps 20 structures scattered along the coastline. Weathered cottages, a combination general store and post office, the old lighthouse that had been automated decades ago, and the harbor where fishing boats came and went like ghosts. Yet something felt different this morning. The buildings seemed sharper, more defined, as if someone had adjusted the focus on reality itself. The colors were more vivid, the rust red of the lighthouse, the weathered gray of the docks, the deep green of the pine forest that crowned the bluffs. Even the silence felt heavier, more purposeful. She had lived here for 23 years, but suddenly Margaret felt like a stranger in her own home. The cottage that had sheltered her through countless storms now seemed foreign, its familiar objects, the hand-carved whale on the mantel, the collection of sea glass on the windowsill, the nautical charts that decorated the walls, appearing as if she were seeing them for the first time. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Margaret frowned. Visitors were rare in Morrow's Cove, especially so early in the morning. She opened the door to find Thomas Ashford, the village's unofficial mayor and owner of the general store. His weathered face bore an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning, Margaret. Thought you should know. We had visitors last night." "Visitors?" Thomas nodded toward the harbor. "City folks. 3 of them. Came in on a fancy yacht just after sunset. Asked a lot of questions about you." Margaret's blood chilled. "What kind of questions?" "About your work, how long you've been here, whether you ever talk about your clients." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Margaret, I've known you for 23 years, but I'm starting to think there's more to your story than you've shared. These people, they knew things about you that even I don't know." After Thomas left, Margaret found herself pacing the cottage like a caged animal. The walls seemed to press closer with each circuit, and the familiar objects that had once provided comfort now felt like evidence of a life she was no longer certain she had lived. She pulled out her laptop and began searching through her files, looking for anything that might explain the visitor's interest. Her client records were extensive but mundane. Fishing cooperatives, marine supply companies, coastal real estate developers. Nothing that should have attracted the attention of mysterious strangers. Yet as she scrolled through her correspondence, patterns began to emerge that she had never noticed before. Certain clients appeared repeatedly across unrelated transactions. Money flowed through complex webs of subsidiaries and holding companies. And at the center of it all, like a spider in its web, was Davies and Associates. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a cold realization washing over her. For 23 years, she had been more than an account manager. She had been a conduit, facilitating transactions that she had never fully understood. The maritime clients she had cultivated weren't just businesses, they were part of something larger, something that required the isolation and anonymity that Morrow's Cove provided. The fog began to roll in again as afternoon faded to evening, and with it came a sense of inevitability that made Margaret's skin crawl. She had been living in a carefully constructed lie, and now that lie was beginning to unravel. The company Gala was 3 days away, and she suspected it would be the stage for a confrontation that had been building for decades. That night, she dreamed of drowning in documents, of signatures that writhed like living things across pages that dissolved in salt water. She woke to the sound of boats in the harbor, their engines rumbling in the pre-dawn darkness. But when she looked out her window, the marina was empty, the water as smooth as black glass. Margaret spent the following day in her attic, searching through boxes she hadn't opened in years. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through the single window, illuminating memories she wasn't sure belonged to her. There were photographs of company events she couldn't remember attending, correspondence with clients whose names felt foreign on her tongue, awards for achievements that seemed to belong to someone else's life. At the bottom of a cardboard box, her fingers found a leather-bound journal she didn't recognize. The pages were filled with her own handwriting, but the words described events and transactions that felt like fiction. Meetings with shadowy figures in waterfront warehouses. Payments transferred through shell companies with names like Tidal Holdings and Abyssal Enterprises. References to the project, and maintaining the cover that made her hands shake as she read. The journal painted a picture of Margaret Holloway that she couldn't reconcile with her own memories. According to these pages, she wasn't just an account manager, she was a coordinator, someone who facilitated something far more complex than maritime business. The isolation of Morrow's Cove wasn't coincidental, it was strategic. The village itself was part of the infrastructure, its dying population providing the perfect cover for activities that required absolute discretion. Margaret slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding. Either she was losing her mind, or 23 years of her life had been carefully edited from her memory. The cottage around her suddenly felt like a stage set, every detail placed deliberately to maintain an illusion that was finally beginning to crack. She descended from the attic and walked to the bathroom, needing to splash cold water on her face. But the woman in the mirror stopped her cold. It was her reflection, certainly the same graying hair, the same lines around her eyes, the same weathered features that spoke of decades by the sea. Yet something was wrong. The reflection moved a fraction of a second after she did, as if the image were being transmitted across vast distances. Margaret raised her hand slowly, watching as her reflection followed the movement with that same slight delay. She touched the mirror's surface, and for just a moment, she could swear she felt resistance, as if her fingers were pressing against something more substantial than glass. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the cottage's oppressive silence. Margaret answered without checking the caller ID. Margaret Holloway? The voice was unfamiliar, professionally neutral with an undercurrent of something that might have been amusement. Yes. This is Rebecca Chin from Davies and Associates. I understand you've been experiencing some confusion lately about your role with the company, your time in Morrow's Cove. I think it's time we had a conversation. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. I was fired 6 months ago. What could we possibly have to discuss? Oh, Margaret. You weren't fired. You were activated. The line went dead, leaving Margaret standing in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. Outside, the fog was rolling in again, thicker than before, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. The harbor disappeared first, then the village buildings, until her cottage seemed to float in a sea of gray nothingness. That night, Margaret sat in her living room with every light burning, the leather journal open on her lap. She read through pages that detailed a conspiracy so vast and complex that her mind struggled to comprehend it. According to her own handwriting, Davies and Associates was more than a consulting firm. It was the public face of an organization that had been operating for decades, using remote locations like Morrow's Cove to facilitate activities that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal, moral and amoral. The maritime clients she had cultivated weren't just businesses, they were nodes in a network that stretched across the globe. Money, information, and sometimes people flowed through these channels like currents in the ocean, invisible to those who didn't know how to look. And Margaret, despite her own memories to the contrary, had been one of the architects of this system. As she read, fragments of suppressed memories began to surface. Meetings in warehouses that smelled of brine and rust. Conversations conducted in code over encrypted satellite phones. Payments that moved through so many intermediaries that their origins and destinations became untraceable. The work had required someone with deep knowledge of maritime operations, someone who could blend into a coastal community without raising suspicion, someone who could maintain their cover for decades. Margaret closed the journal and looked around her cottage with new eyes. The nautical charts on the walls weren't decorations, they were operational documents, marking routes and locations that were crucial to the network. The collection of sea glass on her windowsill contained pieces that were actually sophisticated communication devices, their frequencies keyed to specific contacts around the world. Even her morning routine of watching the harbor had been purposeful, monitoring the comings and goings of vessels that were part of the larger operation. The woman she thought she was, the divorced refugee from city life, the simple account manager who had found peace in isolation, was a carefully constructed identity designed to hide her true role. But if that was true, then who was Margaret Holloway really? And what had happened to the woman she used to be before Morrow's Cove became her home? Outside, the fog pressed against her windows like living thing, and Margaret realized that she might never know the answers to those questions. The only certainty was that in 2 days, she would attend the company gala, and whatever charade had been maintained for 23 years would finally come to an end. Margaret woke to absolute silence, not the usual quiet of Morrow's Cove, but a complete absence of sound that made her ears ring. No wind through the pines, no distant crash of waves, no creak of old wood settling. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, only to discover that the fog hadn't lifted, it had crystallized. The world beyond her cottage existed in perfect, unnatural stillness, every surface coated with a fine layer of frost that shouldn't have been possible in the mild October weather. The harbor was invisible, swallowed by mist so dense it seemed solid. But what disturbed her most were the footprints. They led from her front door down the path toward the harbor, clearly defined in the frost-covered ground. Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she hadn't left the cottage since the previous evening, yet the prints were unmistakably hers, the same size, the same distinctive wear pattern on the left sole where she favored that foot. Following the trail felt like walking through a dream. The familiar landmarks of the village emerged from the fog only when she was close enough to touch them, creating the unsettling sensation that reality was being constructed around her as she moved. The general store appeared suddenly to her left, its windows dark and empty. The lighthouse materialized dead ahead, its beam dark for the first time in her memory. The footprints led to the harbor's edge, where they simply ended. Margaret stood on the weathered planks of the dock, staring down at water so dark and still it resembled obsidian. No boats were visible, no signs of the normal maritime activity that had defined her view of Morrow's Cove for over 2 decades. "You're beginning to remember." Margaret spun around to find Rebecca Chun standing behind her, somehow present despite the fact that the dock had been empty seconds before. The woman was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge. "Remember what?" Rebecca smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Who you really are. What you really did. Why Morrow's Cove exists. I don't understand." "Of course you don't. That was the point." Rebecca moved closer, her footsteps silent on the dock planks. "The memory suppression was necessary, Margaret. The work you did for us required complete compartmentalization. You couldn't know the full scope of the operation because that knowledge would have made you a liability." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. "Memory suppression? Selective editing, really. We left you with enough to function in your role, but removed anything that might have compromised operational security. The Margaret Holloway you think you are, the divorced woman seeking solitude, the simple account manager, she's a construction. A comfortable fiction designed to let you live with what you've done." The fog began to swirl around them, and Margaret caught glimpses of the harbor as it truly was. Not the quiet marina she remembered, but a bustling port filled with vessels that defied easy categorization. Ships that were too sleek, too advanced, moving with purposes that had nothing to do with fishing or tourism. And overseeing it all, figures in expensive suits who watched the operations with the cold efficiency of people accustomed to moving vast resources across international boundaries. What did I do? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. You facilitated the movement of assets that certain governments would prefer didn't exist. Information that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels. People who needed to disappear from one place and reappear in another. Morrow's Cove was a way station, and you were its conductor. More memories surfaced, fragmented but increasingly clear. Late-night arrivals of unmarked boats. Passengers who never spoke and whose faces she was trained to forget immediately. Cargo containers that were never opened in her presence, but which emanated a sense of danger that made her skin crawl. And always, the knowledge that she was part of something larger, something that required her absolute discretion and her willingness to ask no questions. The company Gala, Margaret said. That's where this ends, isn't it? Rebecca nodded. Your memory suppression was always temporary, designed to last only as long as your operational usefulness. But certain events have accelerated the timeline. Your termination wasn't because you were too old, Margaret. It was because we discovered that someone has been tracking the network, following the money flows, identifying the key personnel. Your cover has been compromised. The fog thickened again, and when it cleared, they were no longer on the dock. Margaret found herself standing in what appeared to be her cottage, but it was different, larger, more sophisticated, filled with equipment she didn't recognize. Banks of monitors displayed shipping routes and financial transactions. Communication devices that looked more like abstract sculptures hummed quietly in the corners. And everywhere, documentation that detailed the true scope of what she had been part of. This is your real home, Rebecca explained. The quaint cottage with the sea glass collection was just the public facade. This is where you did the actual work. Margaret moved through the space like a sleepwalker, touching surfaces that felt familiar despite being completely alien to her conscious memories. Her fingers knew the keyboard configurations, the frequency settings on the communication devices, the location of hidden safes and secret compartments. The woman she had been was still there, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed amnesia. Who am I really? She asked. You're one of the most accomplished operational coordinators in the world. For 23 years, you've been the linchpin of a network that spans 6 continents and handles transactions worth billions of dollars annually. Governments fall and rise based on decisions made in this room. People live and die according to your operational parameters. Margaret felt herself fragmenting, the comfortable identity she had lived with for decades dissolving like salt in water. And the Gala? The Gala is where you make your choice. The people tracking the network have demanded a meeting. They want to offer you immunity in exchange for your cooperation in dismantling everything you've built. Davies and Associates, the public face of the operation, thinks you should take the deal. But the real stakeholders, the people who've profited from your work, they have different ideas. Rebecca moved to one of the monitors and activated a display that showed the interior of an elegant ballroom. Margaret recognized it immediately as the venue for the Davies and Associates annual gala, but now she could see it with different eyes. The guest list wasn't just company employees and clients, it included representatives from governments, intelligence agencies, and organizations that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal. Everyone who matters will be there, Rebecca continued. The people you've served, the people who want to destroy you, and the people who are still trying to decide which side offers the better deal. Your appearance at the gala will force a reckoning that's been building for years. Margaret stared at the screen, watching as workers prepared the ballroom for an event that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of a network that had shaped global events for decades. The woman she thought she was would have been terrified. But the woman she really was, the operational coordinator who had orchestrated some of the most complex logistical operations in modern history, felt something entirely different. She felt ready. The day of the gala dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp October light that made everything appear hyperreal. Margaret stood before the mirror in her cottage, or what she now understood was the public facade of her cottage, and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Not because she had changed, but because she was finally seeing herself clearly for the first time in years. The memory suppression had been fading steadily since Rebecca's visit, like fog burning off under the morning sun. Fragments of her true life emerged in vivid detail, the satisfaction of coordinating complex operations across multiple time zones, the intellectual challenge of managing resources that existed in the gray areas between nations. The deep sense of purpose that came from knowing her work influenced events on a global scale. But with the memories came something else, guilt. Not for the work itself, which she was beginning to understand had been necessary in ways she couldn't have comprehended at the time, but for the people whose lives had been affected by decisions made in this room. The passengers who had arrived on unmarked boats and disappeared into new identities. The information that had changed the outcomes of elections and trade negotiations. The money that had flowed through channels she had created, sometimes to causes that history would judge as just, sometimes not. Margaret selected her outfit carefully, a navy dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, jewelry that appeared simple but which she now remembered contained sophisticated tracking and communication devices. Shoes that looked fashionable but were designed for someone who might need to run or fight. Every choice was tactical, informed by decades of experience in operations where appearances could mean the difference between life and death. The drive to Portland took 3 hours, through landscapes that seemed to shift and blur as if reality itself were uncertain. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of other vehicles on the road, noting license plates and passenger configurations with an unconscious professionalism that felt both foreign and familiar. The operational mindset was reasserting itself, pushing aside the comfortable amnesia that had protected her for so long. The Eastland Park Hotel was an elegant establishment in Portland's Arts District, the kind of venue that Davies and Associates had always favored for their annual celebrations. But as Margaret's taxi pulled up to the entrance, she could see the event through different eyes. The valets were too alert, their movements too coordinated. The security personnel were positioned with military precision. And among the guests streaming into the building, she recognized faces that belonged to people who operated in shadows, whose business cards listed occupations that were barely euphemisms for activities that most governments preferred to ignore. Margaret paid the taxi driver and walked through the hotel's revolving door, feeling the weight of decades bearing down on her. The lobby was filled with the usual pre-gala mingling, colleagues and clients engaging in the kind of carefully scripted small talk that had always characterized these events. But underneath the familiar rhythms of corporate networking, she could sense a tension that was almost electric. She recognized the feeling. It was the atmosphere that preceded operations of unusual significance, moments when years of careful preparation came to a head and the future turned on decisions made in real time. The gala wasn't just a social event. It was the culmination of something that had been building for months, possibly years. Margaret Holloway. The voice belonged to Jonathan Davies himself, the man who had ostensibly fired her 6 months earlier. He approached with the kind of smile that was all surface tension, his eyes holding the same mixture of recognition and fear she had glimpsed during their final video call. Jonathan. Margaret studied his face, noting details she had missed during their years of professional interaction. The slight callus on his right index finger that suggested regular firearms practice. The way he held himself, balanced and ready despite his expensive suit. The habit of scanning room exits that marked someone who had been trained to think tactically. "I'm surprised to see you here," he said. "Given the circumstances of your departure, I wouldn't have missed it for the world." Davies' smile faltered slightly. "Margaret, I think we should talk. Privately. There are some things you need to understand about your situation." She followed him through the crowd, noting how other guests watched their progress with interest that went beyond mere curiosity. These people knew who she was, not the public facade of Margaret Holloway, account manager, but her true identity. The question was what they intended to do with that knowledge. Davies led her to a small conference room off the main ballroom, where they were joined by Rebecca Chin and 2 other people Margaret didn't recognize. A tall woman with silver hair who radiated the kind of authority that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions. And a younger man whose nervous energy suggested he was either very new to this level of operations or very frightened by what was about to happen. "Margaret," Davies began, "I need you to understand that the situation has changed dramatically since we last spoke. The people tracking our network, they've made contact. They want to meet." "Here? Tonight?" The silver-haired woman leaned forward. "They've been more specific than that. They want to meet with you, specifically. They claim to have information about your real identity, about who you were before Morrow's Cove." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. The memory suppression had been extensive, but she had assumed it only covered her operational activities. The possibility that her entire personal history had been fabricated opened up possibilities she wasn't prepared to consider. "What kind of information?" Rebecca activated a tablet and slid it across the table. The screen showed a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like Margaret, but younger, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. The timestamp indicated the photo was taken 30 years ago, 5 years before she had supposedly moved to Morrow's Cove. "This is Sarah Mills," Rebecca explained. She was a financial analyst for the State Department, specializing in tracking money flows associated with international terrorism. She disappeared in 1994 after stumbling onto evidence of a network that was facilitating activities that certain elements within the government couldn't officially acknowledge. Margaret stared at the photograph, feeling a recognition that went deeper than conscious memory. The woman in the image wasn't just similar to her, she was her, wearing clothes she could almost remember owning, standing in front of a building that triggered flashes of half-formed memories. "Sarah Mills is dead," she said quietly. "Officially, yes. But the people who are tracking the network believe otherwise. They think Sarah Mills became Margaret Holloway, that the memory suppression wasn't just operational cover, it was witness protection. They believe you weren't recruited by us. They believe you were running from us." The room fell silent as the implications of Rebecca's words settled over them. Margaret found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about her situation. If she had originally been investigating the network rather than working for it, then her position in Morrow's Cove wasn't just operational cover, it was a kind of imprisonment. The memory suppression wasn't to protect operational security, it was to prevent her from remembering why she had been running in the first place. "What do they want?" Margaret asked. The nervous young man spoke for the first time. "They want you to remember. They believe that Sarah Mills discovered something about the network that was so significant it justified making her disappear. They think that information is still buried in your suppressed memories, and they want to help you recover it." Davy stood up, his movements sharp with tension. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. Regardless of who you were before, you've been part of this organization for 23 years. You've been responsible for operations that have saved lives, prevented conflicts, and maintained stability in regions that would otherwise have descended into chaos. The work you've done matters, even if I was forced into it. Even then, the question now is what happens next. The people who want to meet with you tonight, they're not just interested in recovering your memories. They want to use whatever information you have to dismantle the entire network. That would have consequences that go far beyond your personal situation." Margaret looked around the room at faces that were suddenly alien to her. For 23 years, she had trusted these people with her life, had worked alongside them toward goals she had believed were important. Now she was being told that her entire identity might be a construction, that the work she had taken pride in might have been the result of sophisticated coercion. But there was another possibility, one that none of them had articulated. What if the people tracking the network were wrong? What if Sarah Mills really was dead, and Margaret Holloway was exactly who she appeared to be? Someone who had chosen this life, who had found purpose in work that existed in the shadows between official policy and necessary action. The only way to know for certain was to face whatever revelations the evening would bring. Margaret stood up, straightening her dress and checking the position of the devices concealed in her jewelry. "Where is this meeting supposed to take place?" Rebecca checked her watch. "The main ballroom. They want to make contact during your speech." "My speech?" Davies smiled grimly. "Didn't we mention? You're the keynote speaker tonight. The theme is navigating change in uncertain times. We thought it was appropriate." Margaret felt the last pieces of her comfortable amnesia crumble away. Of course, she was the keynote speaker. The operational coordinator who had shaped global events for over 2 decades, addressing an audience that included many of the people whose lives had been touched by her work. It was either the perfect stage for a revelation or the ideal setting for a trap. Either way, it was time to find out who Margaret Holloway really was. The ballroom of the Eastland Park Hotel had been transformed into an elegant theater of shadows and light. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic reflections across walls draped in deep blue fabric, and round tables dressed in white linen created intimate islands throughout the space. The guests, nearly 200 of them, represented a cross-section of the network Margaret was only now beginning to understand in its full complexity. She recognized faces from her recovered memories. Maritime executives who facilitated the movement of cargo that never appeared on official manifests, technology specialists who maintained communication systems that didn't officially exist, financial advisors who managed accounts that were invisible to conventional auditing. But there were others, people whose presence suggested the network's influence extended far beyond what she had previously understood. Margaret stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the crowd with eyes that had been trained to assess threats and opportunities. The operational mindset was fully active now, analyzing sight lines and exit routes, identifying potential allies and likely adversaries. She was no longer the confused woman who had been fired 6 months ago. She was the professional who had coordinated some of the most complex logistical operations of the past 2 decades. A waiter approached with a glass of wine, and Margaret accepted it without drinking. The gesture was automatic: maintain appearances, blend into the social context, but never compromise situational awareness. These were instincts that had been honed over years of operations where a moment's inattention could be fatal. "You look like someone who's remembered something important." Margaret turned to find a man she didn't recognize watching her with interest. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of weathered features that suggested he had spent significant time in challenging environments. His formal attire was expensive but worn with the casual confidence of someone who was equally comfortable in combat fatigues or boardroom attire. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "Not officially. My name is David Park. I represent some people who have been very interested in meeting you." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained neutral. And what people would those be? People who knew Sarah Mills. People who have been looking for her for 30 years. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she managed to keep her reaction minimal. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else." Park smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "Margaret, we know what they did to you. The memory suppression, the constructed identity, the operational conditioning. We know because we've been tracking the network's activities for decades, and you were one of their most significant acquisitions. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Sarah Mills was investigating financial irregularities at the State Department when she discovered evidence of what we now know as the Tidal Network. She had identified key personnel, traced money flows, documented activities that connected dozens of seemingly unrelated organizations. She was preparing to present her findings when she disappeared. Margaret found herself studying Park's face with the analytical precision that had become second nature. He was telling the truth, or at least he believed he was. But there were other possibilities. He could be part of an elaborate deception designed to manipulate her. He could be working for a rival organization seeking to destabilize the network. Or he could be exactly what he claimed to be, someone who had been searching for Sarah Mills for 3 decades. "Even if what you're saying is true," Margaret said carefully, "I don't remember being this Sarah Mills person. The woman you're looking for may not exist anymore." That's what they wanted you to believe. But the human mind is remarkably resilient, Margaret. Memories can be suppressed, but they can't be completely erased. What Sarah Mills discovered is still in there, waiting to be recovered. Across the ballroom, Margaret noticed that the social networking was beginning to wind down as guests took their seats for the evening's formal program. She would be called to the podium soon, expected to deliver a keynote address to an audience that included people who had been hunting her for decades and people who had been using her for even longer. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked. "We want you to remember. Not just the operational details of your work with the Tidal Network, but what you discovered before they found you." Sarah Mills was close to exposing something that went beyond financial irregularities or even illegal weapons transfers. She had found evidence of activities that challenged the basic assumptions about how international relations actually function. Margaret felt a familiar sensation, like the moment when a complex operational plan suddenly became clear. The pieces were beginning to fit together in ways that suggested a picture far larger than anything she had previously imagined. The Tidal Network wasn't just a criminal organization or even a rogue intelligence operation. It was something more fundamental, a parallel structure that had been influencing global events for decades, operating with the tacit approval of governments that couldn't officially acknowledge its existence. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats, we're ready to begin this evening's program." The announcement came from Jonathan Davies, who stood at the podium with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Margaret felt the weight of nearly 200 pairs of eyes as guests turned to locate their assigned tables. But her attention was focused on the subtle movements taking place around the ballroom's perimeter. Additional security personnel had materialized during her conversation with Park, positioned at strategic locations with the kind of professional coordination that suggested military or intelligence training. These weren't the hotel's regular staff, they were operatives, and their presence meant that whatever was about to happen had been planned with considerable care. "Ms. Holloway," Davies continued, "if you would join me at the podium, we're ready for your presentation." Margaret looked at Park one final time. If what you're saying is true, then this speech is either going to be my vindication or my execution. Sarah Mills was never afraid of the truth, Park replied. I hope Margaret Holloway isn't either. Margaret made her way through the crowd, conscious of the subtle ways conversations paused as she passed. These people knew who she was, but there were competing interpretations of her significance. To some, she was a valued colleague whose expertise had been crucial to the network's success. To others, she was a potential security threat whose compromised position required careful management. And to a few, she was something else entirely, a key to understanding events that had shaped the world for decades. She reached the podium and accepted the microphone from Davies, noting the slight tremor in his hands as he stepped back. Whatever was about to happen, even he wasn't entirely certain how it would play out. Margaret looked out at the audience, taking a moment to let her eyes adjust to the stage lighting. In the front row, she could see Rebecca Chin and the silver-haired woman from the earlier meeting. David Park had taken a seat near the center of the room, flanked by two people she now suspected were his colleagues. And throughout the audience, she could identify the subtle positioning of operatives who were prepared for whatever revelations the evening might bring. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, I was asked to speak tonight about navigating change in uncertain times. It's a topic I know something about, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. She paused, feeling the weight of suppressed memories pressing against the barriers in her mind like water against a failing dam. The speech she had prepared, a careful discussion of adaptive strategies in volatile markets, suddenly seemed inadequate for the moment. Instead, she found herself speaking from a deeper truth. For 23 years, I believed I knew who I was. Margaret Holloway, account manager, coastal resident, someone who had found peace in isolation after the complications of an earlier life. But memory, I've recently learned, is more fragile than we imagine. Identity is more constructed than we care to admit. And truth is often more complex than any of us are prepared to handle. The room had gone completely silent. Margaret could feel the tension ratcheting up with each word, as if she were defusing a bomb whose mechanism she didn't fully understand. Some of you know me as a colleague, someone who has worked alongside you for decades in service of goals we believed were important. Others know me as someone who poses a threat to those same goals. And a few of you know me as someone else entirely, someone who disappeared 30 years ago and has been hiding in plain sight ever since. Park leaned forward in his seat, his attention laser-focused. Around the room, the security personnel shifted almost imperceptibly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. The truth is, I'm not certain which of these identities is real. The memories that define us can be edited, suppressed, even fabricated entirely. But there's one thing that can't be faked, the consequences of our actions. The lives we've touched, the events we've influenced, the changes we've set in motion. Those ripples spread outward regardless of what we remember or choose to forget. Margaret felt something breaking loose in her mind, like ice calving from a glacier. Memories that had been locked away for decades began to surface with startling clarity. Not the operational details she had recovered over the past few days, but something deeper, the moment when Sarah Mills had realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more significant than financial irregularities. She had been working late in her State Department office, cross-referencing transaction records that seemed innocuous individually but which revealed disturbing patterns when analyzed collectively. Money flowing from legitimate government accounts into a web of shell companies and subsidiary organizations. Resources being diverted from official programs into activities that weren't reflected in any public documentation. And at the center of it all, a network of individuals who seemed to move freely between government service and private sector positions, carrying knowledge and influence that transcended normal institutional boundaries. The revelation had been gradual at first, then sudden and overwhelming. She wasn't looking at corruption or even criminal activity in any conventional sense. She was looking at a parallel system of governance, one that operated alongside official institutions but with different rules, different objectives, and different accountability structures. It was a shadow government that wielded real power while maintaining complete deniability. 30 years ago, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as the memory solidified, a financial analyst named Sarah Mills discovered something that certain people couldn't allow her to share. Not because it was illegal, exactly, but because it revealed how the world actually works as opposed to how we're told it works. The networks that really move money and resources and people across international boundaries. The relationships that determine which conflicts escalate and which ones are quietly resolved. The mechanisms that ensure stability even when official institutions appear to be failing. Davies had gone pale, and Margaret could see him making subtle hand signals to security personnel positioned around the room. But Park was nodding, his expression a mixture of vindication and relief. Sarah Mills was eliminated not because she was a threat to national security, but because she was a threat to the comfortable fiction that elected officials and public institutions actually control international affairs. The Tidal Network exists because someone has to make the hard decisions, coordinate the necessary compromises, and ensure that the global system continues to function even when official diplomacy breaks down. Margaret paused, feeling the full weight of what she was revealing, not just to the audience, but to herself. The woman she had been, Sarah Mills, hadn't been recruited by the Tidal Network. She had been captured by it, her identity erased and reconstructed to transform her from an investigator into an asset. But Margaret Holloway wasn't just a constructed identity. She was the person Sarah Mills had become after decades of working within the system she had originally sought to expose. The operational coordinator who had found purpose in work that existed in the shadows. The professional who had taken pride in facilitating activities that were necessary but could never be officially acknowledged. The question that remains, Margaret said, looking directly at Park, is what happens to someone who remembers both identities? Someone who understands both the necessity of the system and the cost of participating in it. Someone who has to choose between the comfortable lie that protects global stability and the uncomfortable truth that would destabilize everything we think we know about how the world works. The ballroom remained absolutely silent, as if 200 people were holding their breath simultaneously. Margaret could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge, where a single word could trigger consequences that would ripple across continents. I remember being Sarah Mills, she said finally. I remember discovering the Tidal Network and the evidence I had compiled. I remember the night they came for me. And I remember making a choice that I thought would save my life, but which actually ended it. Sarah Mills died that night, and Margaret Holloway was born from her corpse. She looked around the room, making eye contact with faces that represented decades of her professional life. But I also remember being Margaret Holloway. I remember the satisfaction of coordinating operations that prevented conflicts and saved lives. I remember the relationships I built with people who trusted me to make decisions that they couldn't make themselves. I remember finding purpose in work that mattered, even when that work required moral compromises that Sarah Mills would never have accepted. Margaret set down the microphone and stepped back from the podium. The choice she had to make wasn't between truth and lies, or between right and wrong. It was between two different versions of herself, each complete and valid, each representing fundamentally different approaches to the same underlying reality. The audience waited, and Margaret realized that her decision would determine not just her own fate, but the future of a network that had been shaping global events for decades. The comfortable middle ground she had occupied for 23 years was no longer available. She had to choose who she really was. Margaret stood at the podium for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 seconds, the silence in the ballroom so complete that she could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning system. 200 faces stared back at her, representing not just the audience for her speech, but the stakeholders in a decision that would reverberate far beyond this elegant hotel ballroom. She could see the paths stretching out before her with startling clarity. If she chose to be Sarah Mills, to embrace the identity of the investigator who had sought to expose the Tidal Network, she would walk away from the podium and leave with David Park and his colleagues. They would help her recover the suppressed evidence, protect her while she testified before congressional committees and international tribunals, and support her as she attempted to dismantle a system that had operated in shadow for decades. The consequences would be enormous. Governments would fall as their unofficial relationships with the network were exposed. Economic systems that depended on the careful coordination of resources across legal boundaries would collapse. Conflicts that had been quietly managed through back-channel negotiations would explode into open warfare. The stability that the Tidal Network had maintained through morally ambiguous but practically effective means would disappear, replaced by chaos that could take decades to resolve. But if she chose to remain Margaret Holloway, to embrace her identity as an operational coordinator who had found purpose within the system, she would return to her seat and continue the charade that had defined her adult life. The evidence that Sarah Mills had compiled would remain buried. The network would continue its shadow governance of global affairs, and the comfortable fiction that elected officials actually controlled international relations would persist. The personal cost would be equally enormous. She would never know who she might have been if Sarah Mills had been allowed to complete her investigation. She would carry the knowledge that her entire adult identity was a construction designed to transform her from a threat into an asset. And she would live with the understanding that every operation she had coordinated, every decision she had facilitated, had been made possible by the destruction of the person she used to be. Margaret picked up the microphone again, her decision crystallizing with the weight of absolute certainty. "There's something else Sarah Mills discovered," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Something that even David Park and his colleagues don't fully understand. The Tidal Network wasn't created by criminals or rogue intelligence operatives. It was created by people who understood that the official systems of international governance had become inadequate to handle the complexity of a globalized world." She looked directly at Park, noting the confusion that was beginning to replace the anticipation in his expression. The evidence Sarah Mills compiled didn't just document illegal activities. It documented necessary activities, the coordination required to prevent economic collapse, the negotiations needed to avoid nuclear conflicts, the resource management that keeps billions of people fed and housed and employed. The Tidal Network exists because someone has to make the decisions that elected officials can't make, coordinate the compromises that voters won't accept, and take responsibility for outcomes that no one wants to claim. Margaret felt the memories settling into place, not as recovered fragments, but as integrated understanding. Sarah Mills and Margaret Holloway weren't opposing identities. They were sequential phases of the same person's journey toward comprehending how power actually functioned in the modern world. Sarah Mills was eliminated because she was asking the wrong questions. Not, "Is this legal?" or "Is this moral?" but "Is this necessary?" The people who made her disappear weren't trying to protect criminal activity. They were trying to protect the mechanism that prevents global civilization from collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. The room remained silent, but Margaret could sense the subtle shifts in attention as audience members began to understand what she was really saying. This wasn't a confession or an exposure. It was a justification. Margaret Holloway was created because Sarah Mills needed to understand the system from the inside before she could make an informed judgment about its value. 23 years of operational experience have taught me something that no amount of external investigation could have revealed. The Tidal Network isn't a conspiracy against democratic governance. It's a supplementary system that makes democratic governance possible. Park stood up slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Sarah, they've conditioned you to believe their justifications. The memory suppression, the constructed identity, it's all designed to make you complicit in activities that undermine the very institutions you once served." Margaret smiled, feeling a peace that had eluded her for months. "No, David. The memory suppression was designed to let me experience both perspectives without the bias of my original assumptions. I needed to be Sarah Mills long enough to understand what was at stake, and I needed to be Margaret Holloway long enough to understand what was necessary." She set down the microphone and walked away from the podium. But instead of joining Park or returning to her seat, she moved toward the ballroom's exit. The audience watched her progress in absolute silence, unsure whether they were witnessing a defection, a revelation, or something else entirely. Margaret paused at the ballroom's threshold and turned back to address the room one final time. "The choice isn't between truth and lies, or between right and wrong. It's between chaos and order, between the complexity of reality and the simplicity of ideology." Sarah Mills discovered that the world doesn't work the way we're taught in civics classes. Margaret Holloway learned that it works anyway, because people like you make the hard decisions that keep civilization functional. She looked at Park, who remained standing in the center of the room. "The evidence you want doesn't exist anymore, David. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was integrated into something larger." Sarah Mills became Margaret Holloway because that was the only way to serve the truth she had discovered. Margaret walked through the exit, leaving behind an audience that was only beginning to process what they had witnessed. She had made her choice, but it wasn't the binary decision that everyone had expected. She was neither Sarah Mills nor Margaret Holloway exclusively. She was the synthesis of both identities, someone who understood the necessity of the Tidal Network precisely because she had also understood its costs. The hotel lobby was nearly empty, its elegant furnishings creating an atmosphere of calm that contrasted sharply with the tension she had left behind in the ballroom. Margaret walked through the revolving door and out into the Portland night, breathing deeply of air that tasted of salt and possibility. She had no intention of returning to Morrow's Cove. That phase of her life, the comfortable amnesia that had protected her from the weight of her choices, was over. But she also had no intention of cooperating with Park's investigation. The evidence that Sarah Mills had compiled belonged to a different person, someone who had asked different questions and reached different conclusions. Margaret Holloway had work to do. Not as an operational coordinator taking orders from the Tidal Network's leadership, but as someone who understood the system well enough to help it evolve. The shadow governance that had developed over decades needed to become more transparent, more accountable, more responsive to the people whose lives it affected. But it couldn't be destroyed without destroying the stability it had created. As she walked through Portland's quiet streets, Margaret felt the future opening up before her like uncharted waters. She had spent 23 years learning how the world really worked. Now she would spend however many years remained to her helping it work better. The woman who had been fired for being too old had discovered that she was actually just old enough to understand what needed to be done. 6 months later, Margaret Holloway stood once again at the window of the cottage in Morrow's Cove, watching fog roll in from the Atlantic. But the cottage was different now, no longer a carefully constructed facade hiding operational equipment, but a genuine retreat where she could think and plan and remember without the weight of suppressed memories or constructed identities. The village itself had changed as well. The mysterious infrastructure that had supported the Tidal Network's operations had been quietly dismantled, leaving behind only the genuine community that had somehow flourished alongside it. The population had stabilized at around 40 residents, retirees and artists and remote workers who had been drawn to the isolation and natural beauty of the Maine coast. Margaret's role had changed too, though in ways that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't lived through the revelations of the past year. She was no longer an operational coordinator taking orders from network leadership, but she hadn't become a whistleblower seeking to destroy the system either. Instead, she had become something new, a consultant who helped shadow governance structures transition toward greater transparency and accountability. The work was challenging in ways that pure operational coordination had never been. Instead of simply facilitating decisions made by others, she was helping to redesign the decision-making processes themselves. The Tidal Network was evolving, slowly and carefully, into something that could operate more openly while still maintaining the flexibility needed to address crises that official institutions couldn't handle. It wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But it was better than the alternative, either the complete collapse of shadow governance or its continuation without any oversight or accountability. Margaret turned away from the window and walked to her desk, where a secure laptop displayed encrypted communications from around the world. The messages came from people she had worked with for decades and people she had never met, all grappling with the same fundamental challenge: how to maintain global stability while respecting democratic values. There were no easy answers, but there were better questions. Instead of asking whether shadow governance was legal or moral, they were asking how it could be made more responsive to the people it affected. Instead of demanding complete transparency or complete secrecy, they were working to find sustainable balances between accountability and effectiveness. Margaret opened a new message and began typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who had finally found her true purpose. She was no longer Sarah Mills, the investigator who had sought to expose a conspiracy. She was no longer Margaret Holloway, the operational coordinator who had facilitated activities she didn't fully understand. She was something new, someone who had lived through both identities and emerged with a deeper understanding of what was necessary and what was possible. Someone who could help bridge the gap between the world as it was supposed to work and the world as it actually did work. Outside, the fog continued to roll in from the Atlantic, carrying with it the salt air that had always reminded Margaret of possibilities just beyond the horizon. But for the first time in decades, she wasn't waiting for those possibilities to arrive. She was actively working to create them. The woman who had been deemed too old for her corporate position had discovered that she was exactly the right age to help reshape how power functioned in the modern world. And in the quiet cottage overlooking Morrow's Cove, surrounded by the genuine artifacts of a life she had chosen rather than one that had been constructed for her, Margaret Holloway began the work that would define whatever years remained to her. The truth, she had learned, wasn't something you discovered or exposed. It was something you lived with, day by day, decision by decision, until it became as natural as breathing salt air and as inevitable as the tide.